It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Let's turn the tables today on today's episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. We have with us today a guest host. Yes, that's right. I am not your host today. I am going to be the guest of the day. And our guest host today, Patricia Carrelli, is going to come in and ask me some questions. You know, that is our theme. And she has taken it to heart. And her questions are, to me, about what it's like to direct Shakespeare's plays from an Oxfordian perspective. And we'll get into that in just a minute as I introduce Patricia to the program. Patricia is a retired international educator who started her teaching career here in California. 13 years later, she and her husband Robert, who is a retired drama and English teacher, moved to Taiwan to teach at the Taipei American School there. And while there, they directed and produced more than 30 full-length plays themselves. So Patricia has a little bit of background in producing and directing. She later continued her career when they moved to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and she taught for 9 years there, thus the international educator nomer there. And she first became an Oxfordian when she saw the film Anonymous. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it. If you haven't, you should. We're going to do a future episode about the Prince Tudor theories that are prevalent in that film and whether they're relevant or not to the Shakespeare authorship question, but that's for another day. Today, however, Patricia is a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and she's attended several of their conferences, as well as given presentations to hundreds of students about Shakespeare and Edward de Vere in particular. We welcome you, Patricia.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I'm so glad to be here today. And what you told a little bit about me, I wanted to say a little bit about when I first heard about you before we start our questions. And it's
Here
all
it
right.
comes.
Everything's fine. I was attending the Oxford conference in Oakland, and you made several comments and asked several questions yourself of the speakers and of different presentations. And you were so articulate and so interesting, and you were so specific about some of the comments that you were making that those of us at the table turned to each other and said, who is that guy? He knows a lot about Shakespeare, and I wanted to get to know you and your Shakespeare ideas a little bit more, and hence now I have the opportunity to ask you some questions directly. How did you get started in your Shakespeare path and career?
You know, that's actually a really funny story, because I have been a producer and director since 1993. Yes, I am that old. And
you'd never know it looking at you.
Shakespeare was never really on my radar. It wasn't something that I studied. I mean, obviously you study it in school. I studied it in high school, but it wasn't something even as a theater artist. I've been a theater artist since I was 9, but I had no introduction to Shakespeare as art hardly at all throughout my life until adulthood. And starting my own production company at the time in the early 90s, I was doing contemporary plays and contemporary work. But as a new fledgling producer-director, some of the hurdles to producing work are the costs of royalties. And Shakespeare, of course, is royalty-free. And we had a restaurant in the town I was living in at the time, and they had this beautiful outdoor patio that was very sort of Italianate in its design and in its artistic elements. And I said, we need to pick a play we can do here that's not going to cost us royalties. And I decided Taming of the Shrew was going to be. And Taming of the Shrew will forever hold a dear place in my heart, because it is the very first Shakespeare play I ever produced and directed.
And did you star as Petruchio?
I did indeed.
Right.
Yes, I did.
I suspected as much.
I took on triple duty for that play. And, you know, I, at that time in my life, was aware of the Shakespeare authorship question. It had been introduced to me at a very young age, but I never really pursued it with any interest because, as I said, I wasn't really into Shakespeare.
Uh-huh.
When I started working on Taming of the Shrew, I found, whereas most people I know who will talk about how difficult Shakespeare is or how hard it is to understand, or I don't know what I'm reading, or I found it quite easy.
Accessible.
I did.
Yeah.
And at the time, the people around me said, well, you're a natural at this. You should do more Shakespeare. And that's sort of how it all began.
All right. Great beginning. What about the other people in the cast? Was there ever any discussion about the guy who wrote this material?
Not at that time.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't long after that I was contracted to run the theater department of a private high school.
All right.
And at that time, I was charged with expanding their program. At the time that I was hired, they used to do one musical production a year.
Uh-huh. High school only?
High
Students?
school.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
A high school contracted me to come and become their new
Mm-hmm.
producer director of their extracurricular theater arts program.
Mm-hmm.
And they did one big musical a year. That was all. And I came in and said, I think you need to do one straight play and one musical. Not all kids can sing and dance, but they want to be actors and they want to know the craft and
Sure.
the art.
Good point.
And the principal at the time was very receptive to that idea. And we started doing 2 shows a year. Ultimately, I convinced them we needed to do as many. We were doing, by the time I left there, we were doing 4 shows a year plus competitions.
Oh, my goodness.
But we started a cycle of doing Shakespeare every other year as our fall play.
Oh, outstanding. And of course, royalty free, like you said.
Yes,
So
which was obviously a plus for the school
that's right.
as
They
well.
like that for the budget.
And of course, the English department and even the history departments. But I was very big on trying to create cross-curricular opportunities. So, for instance, when we did Julius Caesar, not only was the English department involved, but also the history department, because they were also studying the history of Rome.
Of
And
course.
it worked out great for the students. It was total immersion.
Exactly. And did you find that combining the history and with the literature really enriched the play and enriched the students as well?
I did, of course. And still at that time, I was not as involved or engaged in the authorship question.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
One of the things that I set about to do, quite honestly, is I said to those closest to me at the time, I'm going to start doing more Shakespeare. I'm good at it. I like it.
Mm-hmm.
And the adage goes, if you can do Shakespeare, you can do anything. And if I can become known as the producer, director, the Shakespeare guy,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
then that's going to raise my status and standing as a producer and a director. And it's going to help put me on the map as far as moving forward with my career.
Sure.
And so I purposely set out to start doing more Shakespeare.
And did you do full-length productions, not just scenes or
Full length productions. Yeah.
Did you do any cutting of the Shakespeare work?
Always.
Yeah.
I don't know.
They can go quite long
Oh,
if you do every single
Very
syllable.
few plays
Right.
survive being cut to some degree,
Mhm.
sometimes just for flow, but quite often for length.
Mhm.
And I was then hired to produce and direct Much Ado About Nothing out at the Ramona Bowl
All right.
in Hemet, California,
Yes.
where the big Ramona pageant is put on every year.
Yes.
And at that time, they were all so breaking into doing other things in that space, including we staged a giant production of Much Ado About Nothing in that space.
Which is outdoors and lends itself to the whole setting of all of it.
Yes, it's a multi-acre stage, so
Yes.
it's a really
How big
space.
was your cast? You had a large group.
I don't recall exactly the number of cast members in that particular production, but I do. But it was as large as we had actors available who wanted to participate
Sure,
because it was such a big space and you could just fill it with more ladies in waiting and more servants
Exactly.
and that kind of thing.
And sometimes, Stephen, with such a large cast, you probably don't have time to get in and talk about each phrase or each motivation of each character. But did you find that as you did more Shakespeare, you wanted to do more of that or develop the character?
One of the great banes of my existence is the fact that I don't get to engage in more table work with my actors. I wish that we had the advantages that that a lot of major theaters have, or that a lot of films have, which is to just do as much table work and preliminary research and all of that before actually getting it on our feet, as we say.
Exactly.
I try to do as much of that as I can now, within the confines of actors' schedules and people not wanting to be committed to something for too long of a period of time because they're auditioning for other things, or they're trying to book, pilot season, or whatever the case might be. Living in the LA area and producing theater in the LA area is a double-edged sword in many, many ways. We have this huge pool of actors, but 90% of them are only interested in, that next web series they can star in, or getting that commercial, or, because they all want to be movie stars.
Right. And it comes down to money sometimes too.
That is very true as well. So, there's sort of there's more theater in LA than in almost every major city in America. The highest density of theaters outside of New York in one place is actually North Hollywood.
Is that right? I didn't know.
And a lot of people don't know that. They say, well, LA is not a theater town. LA is a giant theater town, but because we live in the shadow of the movie industry, oftentimes the theater aspect of LA is forgotten, or, as I say, overshadowed.
True. So it's interesting, you're talking about you don't have time to get into the script necessarily, but then that leads into the author talking about who wrote this material that speaks to teenagers and adult stars and theater people 400 years after it was written. It's really quite incredible.
So most of the actors who have worked with me, especially actors who work with me on a regular basis, who come back show after show, they all know that I'm an Oxfordian. It's not like I keep it a secret by any means whatsoever. Right. In fact, anyone who wants to engage me in the conversation will regret it. Usually at some point try to sneak away from me after an hour or so.
I've been told the same thing, actually, about Edward de Vere.
My wife has commonly been known to say to people, don't get him started unless you know what you're in for.
I've heard the exact same comment.
So definitely it's not something that I keep a secret, but I also don't believe, not only as an Oxfordian, but also as an artist and as a producer director, I don't believe in beating people over the head with the message. For instance, I'm not a social theater artist per se, although I often will lace a production with a social message or a social theme, but I try learning from the master.
Exactly.
I try to sneak it in under the radar. I try to be subtle. I want my audiences to leave the show and on the drive home have those lightning bolt moments where they go, oh, wow, I realize what I just saw now, as opposed to sitting in the chair and the actors or the show or the theme constantly just pounding them with whatever the message happens to be.
Exactly.
I think there are many magnificent social messages in the plays of Shakespeare. One of my favorites, of course, is in Merchant of Venice. Everybody, when you talk about Shylock and you talk about that very famous speech, I think that that's such a revolutionary piece of writing for its time and even today. And I think if you look at how subtle it is, and I also happen to believe that that play is a pure comedy, except for that moment. And that's the point, is that it's funny. Let's all make fun of this. Let's all make fun of it. Because everyone's being made fun of. Not just the Jews are being made fun of in that play. The Christians are also being made fun. Any religious zeal is being made fun of in that play, and how the politics of religion are dictating the actions of the characters in these outlandish and ludicrous ways.
Exactly.
Any play that has a choose the right chest and you can marry my daughter in it is not meant to be a drama in any way, except for in that moment where suddenly Shylock comes forward and says that magnificent speech, and we all are impacted by it, and then we go back to the comedy. And again, it's 30 minutes after the play is over that the audience thinks about, what did I just see? What did I just hear? maybe I shouldn't judge others on religion. Maybe I shouldn't judge others on how they pray, but how they behave. And you think about at the time, the great struggle going on with many people, especially many people in the nobility, between having this family history steeped in Catholic upbringing and Catholic symbolism all over their homes and in their churches. And suddenly, no, that's gone. We're all Protestants now. It had to be very, very difficult for people within certain families to even justify each other. And I think that the author is saying just that.
Yeah, no, I understand completely. And when you talk about the author and you hear that speech, and I have friends who are lawyers, and they've looked at that speech and they said the mind that went into the writing of that speech, especially in the late 1500s, indicates somebody who's had legal training, legal background, has had some exposure to the law, because they bring up points that were very fine-tuned. And the average person, certainly a glover's son from Stratford, wouldn't have had access to the kind of legal materials and manuscripts that could have fostered something like that speech that you're referring to. Whereas we know, knowing about Edward de Vere, that he did attend a legal institution, the Gray's Inn, got a degree from there, and was able to have access to materials and books and literature that provided the foundation to write something so lasting as the work of Merchant of Venice.
And he had to, of course, be very subtle about a lot of his messages and a lot of his themes. Many of his themes I feel are extremely autobiographical, as is true about any great writer.
Absolutely.
But many of them are extremely political, and some of them I think are very specifically aimed at very specific members of court, or to try to influence either members of court and the Privy Council towards a certain action or direction, or the public towards a certain action or direction. And I think one of the brilliant elements of the plays is that ability to be able to focus messages at both audiences at the same time, sometimes in the same scene. And so I, as a director who is an Oxfordian, I take my approach, as I hope, as subtly as he has taught us how. And so oftentimes, because there isn't time in the rehearsal process to engage in a giant debate over who wrote the
it.
play.
True. I understand.
Right?
Right.
So instead of that, I am commonly known to refer to the author as the author.
Okay.
I do that even if I'm working on an Arthur Miller play. I would commonly refer to, well, the author has given us this, let's work with that, or the playwright has given us this, let's work with that. I don't commonly refer to the playwright by name, regardless of who the playwright is on the piece I'm working on.
Even though the author's life could impact clearly what he wrote for the page.
And always does.
Always does.
And always, P.S., always does. And that is the truth about literature, period. I don't care what anyone says. It is impossible not to put yourself into what you have written. And anyone who's written anything, even the most whole cloth fiction, has elements of you in it, whether you want to acknowledge them or not.
Absolutely.
So I will commonly in direction and rehearsal, I'll say, well, the author is intending this, the author is intending that. Occasionally an actor will chime in and go, well, do you mean Edward de Vere? Or
they know.
Most of the time they don't engage in that. They just listen to the direction and try to incorporate it into the play. Occasionally, an actor will come to me after rehearsal and say, well, you said that the author wrote this because he intended this. How do we know that? And then, of course, that will open the door for me to say, well, we know that because this was his life. And then they'll say, I don't remember learning anything about that being Shakespeare's life. And that's when now they've already made the connective tissue, because it all makes sense.
Exactly.
And
And even
their
more
reasonable-
sense.
Yes, their reasonable, rational mind goes, wow, that makes so much sense. But I never learned that about Shakespeare. I said, no, you never learned that about Shakespeare.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. It's like reading Tom Sawyer and not knowing that Mark Twain, grew up on the Mississippi and was familiar with boats. And
he's, of course, the best
example.
Yes,
Right.
of course. Twain is the best example. And then when you tell people that Twain himself believed that it was one of the, as he put it, one of the wolfish earls, I think that was Twain's quote. I might be stealing that quote from somebody else, but
it sounds right.
But definitely it was Twain absolutely believed that it was an aristocrat and that it had to have been. Mainly, he also focused in a lot of the legal aspects of it. And, he has those two characters who are butchering Shakespeare in his own Swiftian or Twainian way.
That's right. Exactly.
Which I think is, also him sort of hinting. It's Twain being just as subtle about delivering the message of doubt about authorship.
Because it's so, the works of Shakespeare are so human. And that's what touches all of us, that the humanity that he wrote about 400 years ago, he had to have lived all of those different kinds of experiences and had those same emotions that we're having today. And so when you're asking your actors to respond to sadness or fear or shock or dismay or anger, it comes from a reality. It comes from a real place because the author had felt that same kind of thing and was able to. And
of course, most artists are in tune with that.
Exactly.
That's one of the reasons why they're artists.
Right.
They understand investing yourself in your art.
Exactly.
And so once you start in the rehearsal process, delivering these little nuggets of information that tie the life of the man to the work, it is very easy for actors to make that connection immediately and go, well, that makes so much more sense than anything I've ever been taught.
Exactly. Have you found any resistance to that?
Oh, yes.
People
haven't we all?
True. But you're working with young people. That it seems like young people would be more accessible, willing to open up.
You'd be surprised. And I find it interesting. I am known throughout my own circles for being somebody who likes to poke millennials in the eye on a regular basis.
Oh, I didn't know that. All right.
and yet I work with them regularly. And I like to say that most of the millennials that I work with are exceptions to the cliche about millennials. We all know that cliches come from someplace.
Someplace of truth.
Yes, they do. But one of the things that I have always found interesting when it comes to this issue among that subsect of society is that it's dichotomous for them, because here is a group who is so against the idea of being force-fed anything, so against the idea of a fascism or a fascist approach of you must believe, you must accept as truth. Yet, in the halls of academia that they have come through, they have allowed professors that they spent 3 or 4 years with to do exactly that to them, to under almost in a fascist ruler type of way, dictate to them that this is what you must think, this is what you must believe, to the point that they will argue it without even knowing why.
And do you feel that they sense immediately, how come the professor is saying this to me? How come he's so certain? And immediately they question it because they're students and that's what students do?
They don't question it, unfortunately, is what I'm saying. And so then when they meet someone like me later on in life and I start bringing to the table details about the life of the author that are found either mirrored or reflected or in some ways just repeatedly referenced in the works of the plays. And you'd be surprised at some of them who come back and go, well, that's not true. And I will engage in the conversation. Well, tell me what is true and how do you know it's true? And ultimately what comes down to with many of them is, well, because my English professor said it was true. Well, your English professor has a very specific interest in saying it's true and in not leading you to ask the questions that are so scary to these, in many cases, white-haired old men who you are allowing to dictate your thought to you.
Exactly. Why do you think it's scary, Stephen? Why do you think that rejecting a myth of hundreds of years is so scary when basically all we're talking about is that somebody wrote these amazing plays and used a name other than his own, but that's what Mark Twain did. That's what a lot of people do with pen names and whatnot. Why do you think there's that fear there of accepting a new author or a new idea that it was a pen name? William Shakespeare was a pen name. Get over it.
Well, I think for a lot of people who have a vested interest in it, it's monetary. At the root of it all, it's really about, paying the bills. So you have a lot of professors and chairs of literature departments and those types who have their names on books and textbooks, particularly. How many college professors make a side living off of writing or co-editing a textbook and then requiring that textbook as reading for their own classes? And that's one of the great travesties of our education system right now, is that kind of, self-propagating insular learning. But so I think there's an aspect of that. I think there's an aspect of fear that their peers, their colleagues, the institutions that they have come up through and are associated with themselves will suddenly ostracize them or ridicule them. So I think that that's a big part of it. And then I also think that a big part of it is that it makes people uncomfortable to question something that they have believed so firmly for so long as true fact, because it then makes them question all the other things they've been taught or told or believed. And quite honestly, I think there's a laziness involved in that. Well, if I accept this as being something we should question, then I have to question everything. And then I actually have to do the work of finding out
the facts, the real thing.
And I think a lot of people are just quite frankly too lazy to do that.
Well, I think that's one reason why these conferences that you and I have both attended are so exciting, because you're gathered together with hundreds of people, very bright people who are very specifically researching information about Edward de Vere and the Shakespeare authorship question. And you can learn so much and gather so much information from their research, not from what they think or what they have heard about, but what they found, actual facts, details, books, connections, documents. And it makes it so exciting and brings all the words of Shakespeare more to life than just basing everything on what you thought you knew.
There are always going to be actors who I work with who are going to shy away from, or even perhaps behind my back, poo-poo or ridicule my Oxfordian positions. However, what I do believe that is not possible is to dismiss the direction I give that comes from that perspective. Just for an example, right now I'm working on a production of Henry IV. All
right.
And though I'm the producer of the production, I'm not the director. One of my close friends, Ron Mills, is directing the play, and I'm playing the role of Henry.
Oh. Great role for you.
One of the things that you can see in and we're doing Henry IV parts 1 and 2.
All right.
So you want to talk about cutting?
Yes, there you have to do a lot of cutting.
Yeah. Which Ron and I poured over the text and poured over the text, and there's still places in each rehearsal where we're like, okay, these lines can go and these lines can go, which it always grieves me a little bit. But also, our audience are not scholars. Our audience want to be entertained.
Exactly.
They want to be entertained by classical work and historical drama, but they're not going to be able to absorb everything that de Vere wanted them to absorb from the play. And one of the things that I find, especially in cutting, that I have to be aware of is I read a passage and I know what he's trying to say, and I know where it's coming from. And so sometimes I'm attached to that passage or that scene because of how connected it is to his life.
Exactly.
Even if it doesn't really advance the story that well.
Exactly.
And so those are the places where I really have to come to terms. But there will be actors who can be dismissive of the viewpoint, but not dismissive of the direction because it's so true and clean. It's not difficult to look at Henry IV and see the amount of guilt that is going on in that play. And in many cases, Henry references Richard II multiple times, almost ad nauseum. And his whole quest of wanting to go to the Holy Land, and which he says is partially based in wanting to keep all of these lords and people occupied with a foreign conflict so that it won't turn inward on him. But truthfully, and I think that one of the reasons why it did turn inward on him is because they all knew that it was derived from his guilt. He felt if he could do this holy crusade, that maybe somehow, some way, God would forgive him for having brought about the death of an anointed king. And it plagues him through his life, and it plagues him through the play. And I believe that it plagued Elizabeth throughout her life once Mary, Queen of Scots, was put to death. And I believe it plagued Edward de Vere for having been on that council who tried and convicted her.
Oh, and that's a terrific point. Not to mention the fact that Edward de Vere also, reports say, accidentally killed a man. And he lived with that and the idea of taking another life. And I wonder if your audiences take away that feeling as much as anything else, is that they could sense something touch them about that play, because everybody has guilt. Everybody has something inside that they wish they hadn't done, not to the extent of killing somebody, but that maybe might be the feeling that they go home with, but they don't quite articulate it like that until they think about it later or hear it in your voice or in your behavior on stage.
So let's say I give that as some backstory for the actors involved in the play, and I say, okay, so here's where this is coming from in this text, is the guilt that Edward feels after having served on the jury that tries Mary, Queen of Scots, him being so connected to the Queen and the court and knowing for a fact the Queen's own guilt over the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, and how she felt like she had been pushed into it, which is how Henry feels in the play at the end of Richard II. So when you have that, and that's evident and obvious, now when I deliver that to an actor as some motivation, and the actor, let's say, gives me some pushback and says, "Oh, that means nothing. It was Shakespeare of Stratford." So what I might say to them is, okay, let's take the two options we have here. If it was Shakespeare of Stratford who wrote this play, then the guilt in the play comes from where? His guilt at having abandoned his wife and children to go and be a businessman in London. His guilt of never educating his children and never teaching them to read and write. Like, where does his guilt stem from that he puts it into this play? Or we can choose Oxford's life, which is so connected to the death of a sovereign.
Exactly.
In his real life.
Exactly.
And you tell me which one explains the play better for the artist.
Exactly. And I think it helps the actors to reach deep down inside and get to something inside that they can relate to that feeling of doing something really bad and feeling bad about it. And then the way it's articulated is so beautiful and healing almost.
And I don't know that in modern times we can fully understand how impactful the belief of an anointed sovereign and the God-given right of royalty was at that time period.
True.
And that the level of guilt and the level of sin that you would have felt at having brought about the death of an anointed king or queen, and what that would look like in the book of life when you get to the pearly gates. I don't think we can quite fathom how much that would have weighed upon the people involved at that time.
That's true. That I understand. You were mentioning about Henry IV, Henry V. My husband and I were just attending the Montgomery Shakespeare Festival, and I always go to bookstores whenever we go to a theater. And one book that had Shakespeare in the title was on display in Montgomery, and it was Shakespeare's Guide to Italy, Richard Rowe's book.
Great
and
book.
It's a terrific book, and I was so excited to see it there. It's a pure Oxfordian book because it goes through the 12 plays that take place in Italy, and Richard Rowe investigated all these obscure comments that are in the Italian plays because Edward de Vere was there. He saw them. He walked the steps. He stood under the portico of Merchant of Venice, and it can be shown that he was there in Italy. Shakespeare of Stratford, on the other hand, never left the island to write these 12 Italian plays because it was expensive to leave. The Queen had to give permission. Anybody who left the island, it was documented and listed. Nowhere did William Shakespeare of Stratford ever leave, but Edward de Vere lived and traveled in Italy for 16 months. So those connectives that we can show with fact and with documentation are so much more impactful, and your connection with the courts. What connection would an illiterate businessman from Stratford have with the courts to know about this tremendous struggle or guilt or what the Queen wanted or didn't want or how she felt or didn't feel? It just seems that everything points in the direction of an author who knew what he was talking about.
I think truthfully, artists should be the greatest doubters of the traditional Stratfordian myth. I think that artists should be the most understanding of how the myth was propagated. David Garrick was like the P.T. Barnum of Stratford.
Good comparison.
And there has been a sucker born every minute ever since. And I think when people, one of the biggest problems that I think I run into, and it's not unsurprising, who else has done this kind of research? Who else cares as much? Who else is as passionate about it as I am? Not too many people in my immediate artistic surroundings are that passionate about it. There have been some who I personally have inspired to become passionate about it.
Sure.
I regularly will purchase used copies of Mark Anderson's book just to have them on hand to be able to give them to people when I find that they're in that place where they're ready now to learn more.
Exactly. Shakespeare by Another Name you're referring to.
Absolutely. Shakespeare by Another Name. Richard Rowe's book is a book that I would give to any director who is about to direct any of the Italian plays, because I think having read Rowe's book, the things that I now understand about those plays that I didn't before reading Rowe's book.
It enriches every scene. That's right.
It explains Two Gentlemen of Verona to in ways that were mind blowing. You read Two Gentlemen of Verona, you go, wow, this is such a fantastical, weird little tale and pirates and blah blah blah. And then when you read Rowe's book and you realize, oh my goodness, they were using these canals. The canal was not only the fastest, easiest, and most convenient way to transport, but it was also the safest way to avoid bandits. What shows up? Bandits. It's
right.
it's so I said pirates because we did a production. I founded the Redland Shakespeare Festival many years ago and ran that organization for almost 10 years, 9 seasons.
Is that right?
And we did a production one year of Two Gentlemen in Verona, and we set it as a pirate themed production because of the bandits in the play. And because, one of the issues about that particular play that people find it one of the problem comedies is the near rape scene, the attempted rape that goes on in the play, which obviously today especially would be very, very sensitive issue. It made it more accessible for audiences to believe that people who are in a pirate world would engage in that type of behavior.
I see.
And also that there would be this forgiveness among friends for that, right? You
mm.
tried to rape my fiance, but I forgive you. Which is kind of one of the scenes that everyone's like, what the heck?
Right.
But again, now let's connect that to de Vere's life and what he believed had happened with his wife Anne and their first child, which is one of the strongest themes throughout the entire canon. And when you know about de Vere's relationship with his wife Anne and his relationship, especially with his firstborn daughter, Elizabeth, not so much later with Bridget and Susan. But definitely with Elizabeth. I think that's like one of the biggest ones.
No, that's a terrific point. I was visiting Westminster Abbey a couple of years ago and went in to make a special visit to Susan de Vere's gravesite. And it's in a section, Anne Cecil's gravesite, and there were several people around there, and we were reading the inscription, and somebody made the comment, "Where's her husband?" That her father's there, her mother's there, her sister's there. There's Anne Cecil all by herself. And of course, Anne Cecil goes on to be the kind of Ophelia character in Hamlet, and it shows up in other places as well, just like you're saying. But when you take out the personality, the exact personality, and you look at the theme, I think you're really onto a point. That
she is so many characters, and I also believe that. So back to this point, because I think it's a very crucial, important point. Is as an artist, I cannot bring myself to believe that William Shakespeare of Stratford was responsible for creating this great art. Nothing in his life, nothing. There is not a single element of his life that speaks art or an artist's heart or an artist's mind or an artist's nature whatsoever. The man from Stratford was a greedy, opportunistic, money-lending, grain-hoarding a-hole who never taught his own children how to read and write. That is not an artist by any means whatsoever. Not that artists don't do crazy and sometimes often horrible and debaucherous things. And Edward de Vere certainly shares in that reputation as an artist and as a playboy courtier. But nothing in the Stratford man's life whatsoever bespeaks him as an artist in any way. Whereas when you look at de Vere, so much of his life bespeaks him as an artist, even if you just consider how much art he paid to have made.
Oh, that's a very good point, of course. And you look at the Shakespeare will, and an artist is going to be concerned mostly with their manuscripts or their history or their legacy or their work. And of course, in the Shakespeare of Stratford will, there's no mention of a book, a piece of paper, story, nothing.
We have a great episode with Bonner Miller Cutting and Don Rubin on that very topic. It's in the collection of episodes. So listeners, if they're curious more about that, they can go and find that. So when you dismiss Stratford, then you have to find who the artist is behind the work. And the best way to do that is to find the life stories that connect to the work. And that's what I think you find when you look at the life of Edward de Vere. He speaks to me as an artist. His life story is so clearly painted in the works, not just the plays, but in the narrative poems and the sonnets, of course, as well. And I, as an artist, there are times when working on certain plays or when seeing certain productions or even reading certain plays, knowing his life, knowing what led to these writings brings me to a new level of empathy for the moment of creation for him. I saw several years ago, we had one of our conferences in Ashland. We have a seminar in July of 2019 happening in Ashland. We had a conference there a few years back, and they were doing Pericles at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I had never seen Pericles live before. It's not a very commonly produced play, and it wasn't really one of my favorites. I had read it, obviously. I've read them all multiple times. but it wasn't really one of my favorites. It's disjointed. It travels to all these different places. It's not an easy show to produce.
I bet.
And it's not one of the most perfectly written either. However, watching it, and I say this all the time, Shakespeare was meant to be watched, not read. Watching it at the end when he's reunited with his daughter, I sat there in the audience and I cried. And the reason I cried is because I'm a father. I have 2 daughters. I understand Edward de Vere as a father. I know the history of what happened between him and Anne and how he refused to acknowledge his daughter all those years, years and years and years, and then later relented and accepted her. And that reunion, the pain, the suffering that poor little girl went through of having to be raised with the knowledge that her father did not accept her as his legitimate child for so long. Like, all of that comes flooding up through that play, and it impacts you in such a way that could never impact you if you believe that Stratford was the guy.
No, you're absolutely right. And the fact that the plays still affect a lot of people who are Stratfordians is a credit, I guess, to the works, but how much richer their experience could be if they had the background of Oxford, like you're just saying.
Treblefold.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say a treblefold. Yeah. And the actors that I have worked with who have opened their minds to these ideas and have then wanted to do their own research. The best actors do research on their own. The best actors are developing their own backstory. They're researching their own characters' histories. They're researching the text. They're researching the words they speak. Hopefully they're doing their scansion, which is a whole nother topic.
All right.
But once the light bulb goes off, then they realize, they get it. And then, and oftentimes they'll come to me and go, I totally understand why you're so passionate about this now, because it changes everything. It changes everything in so many magnificent and beautiful and painful ways that the Stratford myth just can't ever touch because it doesn't fit. Totally.
Stephen, have you ever gone to a Shakespearean production where the director in the director's notes makes comments like this, or connects any of the works, or says, we hope that you'll do further reading about the author, Edward de Vere? Or
only me.
Only you.
I have never been to a performance of a Shakespeare play that anywhere in the program or in the curtain speech or anywhere in the notes, it has suggested or referenced anything to do with the authorship question. When I ran my Shakespeare festival in the festival program, we'd put one program together for the entire festival. So it had, because we were putting on a repertory of 3 plays every season. So we had one big festival guide, which was in newspaper format. And every year we had an article in there about Edward de Vere, about the authorship question. I made it a personal mission that I had this venue, I had this voice, I was going to use it to share, because once I embraced, like I said, I was introduced to the authorship question at at the age of 19 years old, and at that time it was taught to me that Marlowe was the guy. Upon doing my own research, I discovered obviously it wasn't Marlowe, and I came upon de Vere. It wasn't so super important to me until I was working on establishing my festival. And in that process, obviously Shakespeare became more and more of my focus and more of a passion. And then I revisited what I had earlier learned. And then the more study I did, the more I literally, some people would say I became obsessed to some degree, but I feel like for those of us who are as passionate about this as we are, he talks to us. I know that might sound crazy.
Through
people
the plays. No,
you just went off the deep end, Sable.
Right. No,
he talks to us. He wants to talk to us. He's trying to talk to us through the sonnets, through the poems, through the plays. He's trying to say, I'm in here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And one of the underlying layers of pain and grief that you can find evident through across the writings is that pain of having to hide.
No, that's an excellent point. I understand. Some people have said to me, well, why do you care? What difference does it make? We still love Shakespeare and we love the plays. And, so what if somebody else did it? Or so what if it was a pen name? And I taught third grade for a long time, okay? And third graders are all about fairness. And I think I've come up with the idea of an answer to people who say that to me. You say it's just fair that the right person who wrote the stories gets the credit, because for 400 years somebody else has been getting all the credit and the attention, and it doesn't change the work. It doesn't make any difference to anybody, but it's fair that Edward de Vere get the credit for having the pen name of William Shakespeare and producing these works. So
in the truth of that too, I think comes down to this, in that I'm not incensed by the fact that Shakespeare of Stratford has received the credit.
Okay.
Because Shakespeare of Stratford received nothing while he was alive whatsoever.
True.
So even he might be somewhere, wherever the souls go, wherever his is, even he might be up there going, well, I didn't write any of that. Why is everybody saying even he might be saying, this isn't fair.
There you go. Yeah.
Because he never received any benefit from it whatsoever. Nobody gave a flying quill about Stratford until Garrick wanted to make money and turned it into Shakespeare Disneyland. And that's another thing I think a lot of people don't get, is that it wasn't until 1769, I believe it was, 1759. I might be off by a decade there.
But you're close. It's in there.
We're talking, it's not until the latter part of the 18th century that anyone cares about Stratford. And it's all because Garrick gets this idea, I'm going to put on a jubilee. And the very essence of the jubilee was a lie, because he called it the 150th anniversary. It was actually the 153rd anniversary. He was off by 3 years, but he lied. He lied because that's not marketable.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. All of these people who cleave to this mythology for so long, if they understood that they're victims of marketing by an opportunistic actor who was trying to make a quick buck at the later part of his career when he couldn't sell tickets very well anymore.
There you go. Exactly. And he went home and nobody knew he was a writer or cared. He couldn't write his name very well. And his daughters didn't even know that he was a writer. So what credibility did he possibly have?
That's one place where I have found it's interesting. Is women tend to be much more open to this than men.
Oh.
Actresses want to embrace it. They're not as, I don't know if it's a testosterone thing with men that they want to draw a line in the sand and like, no, you can't change what I know and believe. Whereas women are much more open to listen and hear and discuss and
they hear
consider.
they hear that feminine sensitivity, perhaps.
I think that's a big part of it.
Yes, coming through in De Vere's work.
Women actresses I know want to play these roles so badly, and the really good ones want to play the really good ones. Like the really good actresses want to play some of the roles that are not the most famous, popular roles. Everyone wants to play Kate. I don't know why. That's like one of the worst characters in the canon. It's one of the least.
More shallow than the rest. Yeah.
But okay, fine, Kate. But the really good actresses, they want to play Constance in King John. They want to play Helena in All's Well That Ends Well.
Interesting.
They want to play Catherine in any of the Henrys.
Okay, there you go. Yeah.
So I think that to some degree, the women who want to embrace those roles realize that the man who wrote those roles had to have been in tune, highly in tune with the feminine
side,
and what the feminine represented in that time period, and how that even transcends to today, because what is feminine hasn't changed. It's just our attitudes towards it and how we praise it, elevate it or not, that has changed. And then once they're on that theme, and then you say, oh yeah, and the guy from Stratford, if he wrote all these wonderful female roles, he thought that they weren't important to share with his own daughters
who couldn't read or write
because he never taught them how to read his own
Exactly,
plays.
exactly.
And that just doesn't sit with them.
Yeah.
They're just like, that cannot be.
Yeah.
Why would
Yeah.
he do that? Why would the man who created the strength of a young Juliet who stands up to her father and says, I will not marry but for love, is just one example. Or the Portia who dresses as a lawyer and comes in and delivers this magnificent legal argument. Rosalind, who is P.S. the largest female role in the canon, who becomes the ultimate love guru.
Oh,
because
I haven't
even
heard her called that.
under the guise of being Ganymede, under the guise of her disguise, the advice that she gives to Orlando, the prophetic things that she says about love and relationships is truly wise.
Isn't that so?
And again, it's that subtle way of him delivering philosophy through the comedy that makes it brilliant.
Yeah.
And that's why she has so much to say, because she's a love guru.
And why women today are listening to her and paying attention. And directors
and why men today should be listening to her and paying attention as well.
Exactly. It's the humanness, not just the male or the female part. It's that humanity that comes through.
In the whole motivation of her, which is the motivation of women of the day who were wise and smart, or should have been if they weren't, which is, I'm not just going to believe these flowery words that you say that you love me. You have to prove it to me before I'm going to believe this love you claim you have for me. That was revolutionary for a woman to take on that position. So I think that women who see these characters and go, God, the guy who wrote these really knew what was going on, was really in tune, and really helping women to establish themselves as separate from the very misogynistic and very chauvinistic system that they lived in at that time. And then to say, oh yeah, but none of those female roles were important enough for him to share with his own daughter.
Right.
As a father of daughters, no way. No way.
Exactly. Yeah.
I can't wait to share these roles with my daughters, and I didn't even create the roles or write them.
Of course, that's right. What they can learn from them and experience and understand far earlier than you or I did, because our education as far as de Vere goes started much later than it will for your daughters and your children and my children.
And when you look at Anne Cecil as the model for some of these characters, Anne Cecil is Helena. Of All's Well That Ends Well. Now, that is not a play that I have produced or directed yet. It's on my list.
Okay.
I'm going to do them all eventually.
Good.
It's not an easy one to sell because it's not as popular and people don't really know it, and because it's so autobiographical that one of the only ways you can really appreciate that play is to know de Vere's life. And then once you know de Vere's life and you see All's Well That Ends Well, you go, oh my God, it's his life played out right in front of you. He is Bertram.
Exactly.
He is absolutely Bertram, and she is absolutely Helena, even down to her supreme medical knowledge, which she uses in the play to cure the king.
Oh, right.
And Anne Cecil was known specifically for her learning. Look at who her father was.
Exactly.
And she had a particular propensity and affinity for medicine and healing and using Paracelsian medicine, which is compounds and herbs to treat the disease.
See. Right. And of course, at that time, Cecil had such a huge library. She had access to the books and education and doctors and the latest in scientific exploration. Astronomy, I read that de Vere was good friends with the astronomer of the day. And
it turns out that William Cecil was actually very forward thinking of his time too, in that he did allow his daughter to be educated and did foster her education. Now, some of that came from his wife. I believe her name was Mildred. And by all accounts, she wore a lot of the pants in the household. And so I could see where she would be like, no, our daughter is going to learn these things and know these things.
Exactly.
But, by all accounts, Anne Cecil was a brilliant and formidable scholar in her own right of the things that she was allowed to study and that she found passion for.
Right.
And I think you see that in so many of the characters.
Absolutely.
She is Hermione. She is Helena. She is so many of those roles.
Yeah.
She is the young Ophelia, obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Stephen, I hear a book in you, or I hear a full-page director's notes in every Shakespearean play that's going to be produced from now and for years to come. Because where do we go from here? You have this passion, you have this knowledge and information, and the research is being done. The facts are there. The scholars and the researchers are compiling this information. Where do we go? How do we proceed from here? Besides, of course, these podcasts, which are a great opening to a lot of folks. But what do we do from here?
Well, I have always said, and people laugh at me because I'm the jack of all trades and master of none. I have my toes into so many different ponds and pools at so many different times that. And I always have these ideas for other projects. And, my wife particularly will say, yeah, and you're doing that in which lifetime?
Let's stick to this one.
Right. But I have, for the longest time now, had the idea that Oxfordians are missing out on a golden opportunity that we need to embrace somehow through some coordinated effort. And I know that part of that is because the minds that it needs are all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
And getting them all in one room is
all over the world, actually.
Yes,
yes.
And getting them all in one room is not the easiest thing to do. They're all also just as involved in so many things. Mm-hmm. So there's that as well. But I have always said that what we need is a play that tells this story, that tells the story of how his life becomes a play. And I envision a series of scenes based on his letters and letters to him, based on the historical record of Edward de Vere's life that we know for fact.
For fact, that's right.
Obviously, the dialogue.
Not hearsay. Right.
Obviously, the dialogue has to be fictional based on fact because we weren't there, although you can use certain phrases and certain ideology from his letters and from his writings and vice versa in the scenes that you have him with William Cecil, for instance, or you have him with Robert Cecil, for instance. And I think
letters.
I think that if you play out scenes from his life in front of an audience, and in the middle of that scene, let's say, for instance, there is a scene where Edward is on stage with William Cecil and with William's other son, Thomas, who we don't hear a lot about.
All right.
Right. But it is Thomas who was the one who was sent off to France. It is Thomas who received the advice that is then later mocked in Hamlet, Polonius giving to Laertes. That comes from the words of William Cecil to his son Thomas, which Edward would have witnessed. And that's how we get then Polonius giving that speech to Laertes in Hamlet. Right. And if you show that to an audience, if you begin it with the scene of Edward and William and Thomas, and it suddenly starts to shift into the text of the play, and it becomes William becomes Polonius and Thomas becomes Laertes right before our eyes. I think that's how you connect the tissue for an audience. We're a visual society, and I think literally, you remember, you're a teacher who's been teaching for quite some time. You know those overlays they used to do?
Sure. You go.
We need an overlay.
We need an overlay. And we need a part 2 podcast of this great conversation. I've really enjoyed asking you questions and hearing your responses and getting to know you and your background and your Oxfordian experience. And I'm excited for our viewers to hear your ideas. And we look forward to the play that you're going to write or the overlay you're going to design for our next get-together.
Well, I think the first step to that is to identify, let's say, the top 8 to 10 moments in De Vere's life that become the top 8 to 10 most popular scenes in the canon, and then start tying them together and connecting them together. It would make a great HBO series, by the way.
You are absolutely right. I'll be signing up right away. Fantastic.
Well, thank you, Patricia, for joining us today and switching seats with me and giving me a chance to do something I hate to do, which is talk about myself and my love for this topic.
Well,
but it has been fun to kind of sit in this chair today for a bit. we'll hope that you'll come back and join us again for another episode on another issue or another topic. I'd love to hear more about what it's like to produce plays in Taiwan. For instance, and doing Shakespeare in Taiwan had to be very interesting.
With Chinese actors.
Yeah, I'll bet that was very exciting. We want you to be sure to find other episodes of Don't Quill the Messenger on your favorite podcast provider. Make sure, if it is available, that you give us a rate and a review. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you think about the show. Tell others what you think about the show. Share us. Share me. Share this. Share the word. Share the news. Share the truth. And if you need more information, don't forget to visit ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, your source and resource for everything you need to know about the Shakespeare authorship question and the life of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. We hope you'll join us for future episodes of Don't Quill the Messenger, revealing the truth of Shakespeare authorship. Become a quiller, won't you? And don't forget, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.